On the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who attended him to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing the royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, conveyed by the eunuchs. At this, the king was enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king consulted the sages who knew the laws, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and custom. And those next to him were the 7 officials of Persia and Media, who had access to the king and sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus, conveyed by the eunuchs? Mehuman said in the presence of the king and the officials, "Not only has Queen Vashti done wrong to the king, but also to all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen will be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt for their husbands, since they will say, 'King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come.' This very day the noble ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard the queen's behavior, will rebel against the king's officials, and there will be no end of contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and Medias, so that it may not be altered, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another better than she."
Someone just said, "Good luck." Well, first, after last week's Ask the Minister section, this is a relief. Secondly, you may not be aware of this because there's basically been nothing written or said about it in the newspapers or the media or online for the last couple of weeks. But today is Super Bowl Sunday. Super Bowl Sunday, the day in which the championship game of the National Football League is held, the highest level of professional football in the United States. And there is a long history of stories associated with the Super Bowl. Every year there are stories told in the lead up to the game and really all the way through to its end. For the most part, those stories tend to be encouraging, inspiring, even heartwarming. Stories about some player or team overcoming adversity, or some player or team achieving greatness because of their hard work and their dedication. Stuff like that. But occasionally, there will be a story associated with the Super Bowl that is a little bit more melancholy, even sad. Like the story I heard associated with the Super Bowl a few years ago. It seems that about a half an hour before kickoff, before the game started, a man went to take his seat in the stadium. And as he got to his seat, he looked over, and 2 seats over, there was a woman sitting there, an empty seat in between them. He smiled, said hello to the woman, sat down. Didn't really think much about the fact that there was an empty seat there. But then when the game started and the seat was still empty, he started to get a little curious. And when the first quarter ended and the seat was empty, he got even more curious. And when at halftime the seat was still empty, he just couldn't help himself. Turned to the woman, he said, "Excuse me, ma'am, but do you have any idea why this seat is empty?" The woman sighed, said, "Yes, I do. That seat belonged to my husband. He and I came to every Super Bowl for over the last 40 years, but he recently passed away." Now the man in the other seat was heartbroken. He didn't know what to say, and I guess because he was trying to be helpful, he turned back to the woman. He said, "Excuse me again, but I know this is hard, but didn't you at least maybe have a son or a daughter or a grandchild or another relative or a friend that you could have given this seat to?" And the woman said, "Well, maybe, but they're all at my husband's memorial service right now." So apparently, while the woman and her husband were great football fans, their relationship, maybe not so great. Not so great like the relationship between King Ahasuerus and his wife, King Vashti. The very first scene in the book of Esther from the Hebrew Scriptures, the writer tells us that King Ahasuerus decides to throw a party for the entire kingdom, and a party that lasts 6 months. Kind of reminds me of my college days. A 6-month party for the entire kingdom. And then if that's not enough, after that party ends, King Party Animal decides to throw another party. This time a week-long party that is just for the inhabitants and his officials in the city of Susa, which in the time that the book of Esther is set, about 450 to 500 years before Jesus, was considered to be the winter retreat for the Persian king. Ahasuerus is the king of the Persian Empire. Decides to throw this week-long party. And what a party it is. It may not be anywhere near as long as the first party, but it's a lot more opulent. The writer tells us that this party is characterized by fancy curtains and golden couches and floors made of porphyra, which seemed a little odd to me at first. It didn't make any sense to me that anyone would make a floor out of a mix of flower petals and spices that smell good, and then I realized the word wasn't potpourri, it was porphyra, which is apparently a kind of rock. An opulent party. And the drinking. Oh, the drinking. The writer tells us that the wine is served in golden goblets, and, these are the writer's exact words, without restraint. But then, starting the passage that Sharon just shared with us, things take a serious turn. Senses dulled, I'm guessing, by that long historical combination of alcohol, power, and ego. The king sends a command to Queen Vashti, his wife. A command that she appear before all of the people and officials of Susa, all those present at this party, wearing the royal crown. Because, as the writer tells us, she was fair to behold. Or as Dr. Lynn Japinka, a woman who is a professor of religion at Hope College in Michigan and the author of a book about women in the Hebrew Scriptures called From Widows to Warriors, puts it, Vashti was one hot smoking babe. But Vashti refuses the king's command. Refuses to appear wearing the royal crown. And the king is enraged. Enraged. He goes to his legal firm, a firm with 7 partners, a very long name for the firm. I left out all of those names from the text that Sharon read. She noticed that, right? And the one that all of you have, because they're very unfamiliar, difficult to pronounce names, and I was afraid if I asked Sharon to read those names, I would never get another liturgist as long as I'm here. Left out the names. Ahasuerus consults his legal firm, and after deliberation, the senior partner of that firm, a guy named Memucan, says to the king, this is what you got to do. You have to banish her. You have to banish Vashti and depose her as queen. Banish her from ever appearing before you again. And you know, I don't really think that's going to take care of everything. Because if word gets out that she refused your command, women all over the kingdom are going to do the same thing. So you better issue an order for the whole kingdom that wives need to obey their husbands' commands. That men are to be the masters of their houses. And the king does. The king does. Now, we should take note of the fact that the book of Esther is considered by most scholars to be a fable, a farce, a satire. They point, for instance, to that overblown 6-month party. They point to things like the over-the-top reaction of Memucan to what should have been just a conflict between a couple. They point to the fact that there is no historical record of a king named Ahasuerus, that he is meant to be a caricature of an actual king at that time, a guy named Xerxes. They point to the fact that there is no historical record of a queen named Vashti. And they also point to the hijinks which ensue after Vashti is deposed, because that's when Esther, who the book is named after, enters the scene. They point to the fact that Esther becomes queen, Esther, a young Jewish girl, but she has to hide her identity because another one of the king's advisors, a guy named Haman, has convinced the king to issue an order that all of the Jews in the Persian kingdom be deposed of, because one of those Jewish people, who happens to be Esther's uncle Mordecai, refused to bow down to Haman after the king issued that order as well. So they point to all of those factors as evidence that it is meant to be satire, farce, fable. All that stuff about Esther, that's for another day. But for today, one, as we know, throughout history, fable and farce and satire have been deeply meaningful and effective means of exploring important human issues and concerns. And two, despite the fact that this scene and Vashti's involvement in it is often looked at as just prelude, as just a way of getting Esther into the story, let's not be so quick to move past it. Because it seems to me that in the dynamic involving the king and Vashti, Memucan, and the rest of the kingdom, there are some serious human issues and concerns to be explored, particularly around the subject of relationships. And especially particular to that, the harm that can be caused to relationships by contempt. See, that's the word. That's the word Memucan uses twice. He says to the king that if he doesn't banish Vashti, take away her crown, punish her, then women throughout the entire kingdom are going to start to show contempt for their husbands. And there will be no end to the contempt in the kingdom. Not every translation uses the word contempt, but others use synonyms for it, because that word contempt simply means to feel or demonstrate scorn or disdain or serious disrespect for another person or another group, to even despise them. And contempt, as John Gottman tells us, is a relationship killer. John Gottman is the professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Washington and the longtime co-founder and co-director of something called the Gottman Institute. And for decades, the Gottman Institute and John Gottman specifically have been studying relationships. They have been studying the difference between unhealthy and healthy relationships. In our terms, the difference between unhealthy relationships and the kind of relationships that God calls us to have with each other. And while Gottman's work has been primarily with married or partnered couples, he and most experts agree that the findings of the Gottman Institute and Gottman's findings are applicable to all kinds of relationships, whether it is person to person, person to group, or group to group. And Gottman says that while contempt can be rooted in a number of different factors, it is primarily, most of all, rooted in superiority. In the sense, in the belief that one is superior to another, that one is superior to another person, or superior to another group, or that one group is superior to another group. If that's the case, then where is the contempt in this story really? Because I don't think it's with the women of the kingdom. They haven't demonstrated anything yet. And I don't think it's with Vashti either. Yeah, but she disobeyed the king's command, right? I mean, isn't that contempt? Isn't she the one showing contempt? Well, the king's command about that, the idea that the king asks her to appear wearing the royal crown, well, according to a number of biblical scholars, including Lynn Japinga, who I mentioned earlier, and the renowned rabbi and biblical scholar Joseph Telushkin, the Hebrew that the book of Esther is originally written in strongly suggests that the king's command isn't that Vashti appear wearing the royal crown, but that Vashti appear wearing nothing but the royal crown. Puts a little bit of a different spin on it, right? At best, that is extremely objectifying. At worst, it seems to demonstrate disdain, scorn, serious disrespect for her, contempt for her. And she is having none of it. She refuses it. She resists it. because contempt is a relationship killer. And Mamukin, well, he insists on that kingdom-wide order because he is afraid that his belief in his superiority is being threatened, which John Gottman also says is another characteristic of contempt, that one will do anything to keep one's sense of superiority from being threatened. Gottman tells us that when it comes to relationships, contempt is the most destructive force there is. Contempt rooted in a sense of superiority over another, like the king and like Mamukin. The most destructive force there is when it comes to relationships. Now, again, it's vital to mention at this point, Gottman is very clear that contempt is not exclusive to men and their relationships with women. He is very clear that men engage in contempt for other men, that women engage in contempt for men, that women engage in contempt for other women. In fact, the only other story in the Bible, which in our translation, the one we use today, uses the word contempt in the context of a person-to-person relationship, it's in the story of Abraham's wife Sarah and her servant girl Hagar. And then, of course, Gottman points out that groups engage in contempt for other groups. And it is the most destructive force there is. The very same thing that Arthur Brooks claims. Arthur Brooks is the endowed chair of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, author of numerous books, a person known, renowned as a leader when it comes to thoughts about leadership and ethics and morals and all of that. And Brooks claims that we are becoming more and more a culture of contempt. More and more a culture in which people have come to see themselves, to believe that they are superior to others. Groups have come to see, to believe that they are superior to other groups. More and more a culture in which more and more people and more groups are coming to believe, or, Brooks is clear to point out, are being encouraged to believe by media and by political and religious leaders that they are superior to others. A superiority that leads to the contempt that Brooks is so concerned about. A superiority that leads individuals and groups to see those who are different from them or disagree with them as fools or stupid or unpatriotic or un-American. You name it. And Brooks says we must resist. We must refuse to engage in that kind of contempt, and we must stand up to those who encourage it. But Brooks says we must stand up equally to those who encourage it, whether they are from the other side, from the other team, or from our own. Stand up to it like Vashti did, like God calls us to. Even though God's not in the book of Esther. It's a very curious detail about the book of Esther. there's no specific mention of God in it. God is not explicitly mentioned in the book of Esther. It's the reason why biblical scholars, and going way, way back, have debated whether the book of Esther even belongs in the Bible at all. But I would say, just because God's not explicitly mentioned doesn't mean God's not there. You know, last week during the Ask the Minister session, I stated something that I've stated before, and if you're not tired of it already, you will be by the time our years together are over, which is that each of us can find at least one thing in the Bible to support anything we want. Which to me means then that the more important question is, what are the patterns? What are the consistent patterns of the biblical literature? And one of the most consistent patterns in the Bible is relationship. God's call for us to be in healthy relationship with God and in healthy relationship with others. And in those relationships that God calls us to and that Jesus calls us to in the Gospels, there is no room for superiority. There is no room for the sense or the belief that we are superior to another person or another group. When we are told over and over again that we are all the equally loved and valued children, the sons and daughters of our God. Long before John Gottman and Lynn Japinga and Arthur Brooks and all the rest came to understand how destructive contempt is in relationships, God already knew it. God already knew it and called us and still calls us today to resist it, to refuse to engage in it, just like Vashti. Because God has known all along that contempt, well, to put it in different terms on this Super Bowl Sunday, that's a losing game. A losing game for all of us. Amen.